it's why I think it's so important to be pushing those boundaries back, because people, even if they can't put their finger on it, they react to the fact that something is fresh and new and different. And so it's something that, I think is really critical to be constantly trying to innovate in your photography.
Alex Mustard there, one of the elite underwater photographers in the world, on the importance of innovation in photography. Alex pours all of his knowledge and expertise into our chat, and I'm really privileged to have him on the show today. Well, my name's Graham Dargy. I'm a professional photographer and roller skating rookie from Aberdeen, Scotland, and this is the Viewfinders Photography Podcast, where I talk with the best photographers on earth, and today, one of the best under the sea. Thanks for checking in today. I hope you're keeping well. Things are pretty good here. We had a few days away as a family last week to Inverness, which was a welcome break. And the time we spent up there in the area around Loch Ness, and the drive back home through Speyside Whisky Country, as it's known, past all these amazing distilleries through this wonderful scenery, really reminded me of what an incredibly beautiful place Scotland really is. Just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who's been checking out Season 3 of the podcast these last couple of weeks. The first 2 episodes have been so well received, and I'm really grateful for people tuning in from all around the world and for the great feedback that we've had. It really means a lot to me and to the guests, so thank you. The rest of the season is shaping up to be really, really special, and I've got some amazing guests in the next few weeks, as well as some brilliant live events coming up, so I hope you can stick around for those. Okay, speaking of live events, segue. A quick shout out for my next Viewfinders live event. That's Food Photography with Donna Krause, sponsored by MPB, coming up on Sunday the 13th of June 2021. Donna Krause is a Nikon ambassador and a Rotalight Master of Light, and one of the most sought after food photographers in the UK. Donna's fantastic, one of the smartest, most creative people I've met in photography, and one of the best at what she does. So join us on Zoom to learn how Donna creates her amazing food photographs, including styling, camera settings, lighting, and more. If you're into food photography, still life photography, or if you just want to expand your photography knowledge and hang out with some like-minded photography enthusiasts, then come along. That's Sunday the 13th of June 2021, 7:30pm UK time on Zoom. Tickets are available for just £12 at the Viewfinders website. That's viewfinderslive.com, and the link is in the show notes. Don't miss it. The event is sponsored by MPB, who are also sponsoring the podcast this season. If you've got something in your photography bag you're not using, and don't we all, then trade it to MPB to get something you will use, or just get some money in your pocket. MPB makes selling your kit easy, and everything you buy comes with a 6-month warranty. So go check out their website and follow them on Instagram. Links are in the show notes. As always, you can catch me on Instagram at Viewfinders Podcast. You can also check out the new Viewfinders website, viewfinderslive.com, where you'll find everything to do with the show, including previous episodes and upcoming live events. Right, my guest today is Dr. Alexander Mustard MBE, better known as Alex Mustard, who's been taking underwater photographs since he was just 9 years old, and he's worked as a full-time underwater photographer since 2004. Alex has a PhD in Marine Ecology, and his combination of subject matter expertise, underwater photography experience, technical innovation, and sheer passion makes him one of the absolute best in the world at what he does. Alex Photography has won many awards, including European Wildlife Photographer of the Year in 2013, 4 category wins in the British Wildlife Photography Awards, and the ADEX Award for Extraordinary Contribution to Underwater Photography in 2016. In 2018, he was made an MBE for his achievements as an underwater photographer. He's written more than 500 articles for photography, marine, wildlife and diving publications, as well as 5 books of his own, including Underwater Photography Masterclass. Alex is also the inventor of Magic Filters, a filter system specifically for underwater photography. He's the associate editor of wetpixel.com, an online community for underwater photographers, and he teaches underwater photography workshops all over the world. So, fair to say, we're talking with an expert here today. On the other hand, I know nothing about this kind of photography, so it was fascinating for me to sit with Alex, learn, and just witness his sheer enthusiasm. For me, he overflows with experience, expertise, fieldcraft, and an incredible knowledge for the wildlife and ecosystems he photographs. Most of all, he has an infectious passion for what he does. It's a real privilege for me to have him on the show, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. here's my conversation with Alex Mustard. Hi Alex, thanks for coming on. How's things?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, it's as good as they can be at the moment, but yeah, all pretty good.
Yeah, well, we're recording this in March, right?
Yeah, tail end of March.
It's going out later, so who knows what the situation will be then. But I'm really excited to talk to you because this underwater photography, it's nothing like anything I've done before. So if I can talk to a landscape photographer or a commercial photographer or a studio photographer on some kind of level, because I've done those things. But with this, I'm here to learn. So I'm really looking forward to picking your brain a bit. So for people who may not know you, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your photography?
Sure. My name's Alex Mustard. I live in England. I'm an underwater photographer, and that's usually work that takes me all around the world, predominantly shooting natural history subjects, but I also photograph people underwater, shipwrecks, and that sort of thing. But very much usually working in the ocean. I've not done any photography since late last year. We've obviously had a lot of lockdowns across the UK, which has limited my ability to go out and shoot. And to be honest, with family commitments as well, I've been happily engrossed on my computer, processing images, writing, and also teaching online. So that's kept me out of trouble. A little bit about my history. I suppose my photography is best known to a wider audience, probably through big competitions and things like that, where my sort of weird underwater pictures get seen by a more mainstream audience. So I've had a lot of success down the years in big competitions like the Wildlife Photographer of the Year and other competitions around. I think an unusual thing that happened to me in my career was a couple of years ago I got proposed to receive an MBE from the Queen as a result of my photography and what I've done, which is a very unusual thing to happen as a photographer. I think the honours system is an unusual system, and I think that you could apply, or you could be proposed every year of your life, and then one time your lucky numbers come up. So I feel very lucky that happened for me. I have no idea still really how it happened, but it was an amazing experience and something I really appreciate. I'm also well known as a teacher of underwater photography, and I wrote a book back in 2016 called Underwater Photography Masterclass, which has become sort of the most popular book on learning underwater photography, which I really am grateful for. And it's a book I really put a lot of heart and love into. It's a book that's designed not only to teach you how to take amazing underwater pictures, but also to make people really fall in love with the activity. So I'm glad it's been so well received.
I noticed on your website that you seem to spend a lot of time hanging out with royalty. There's a few pictures of you doing that, so it must be nice to be moving in those circles.
I think it's. I used to work as a marine scientist. I did my PhD in marine ecology, and used to write articles about. I used to do research and write articles, which would probably get read by 30 people in the whole world. And what was amazing when I transitioned into photography is by taking pretty pictures of the sea, which I used to study. It opened these incredible doors for me, and it is a reminder of how the population at large absolutely adores imagery, and astounding, original, eye-catching imagery just does open those doors. And yes, and it's it allows you to enthuse to all sorts of important folks, but at the same time also to be invited to the local school and tell them about the ocean, and I think that's a real privilege of being a photographer, is those images do open doors and allow you to share your passions. And certainly for me, that's something I've really enjoyed. But yeah, I've had the odd photo call moment, so it's been quite fun.
Yeah, I was really keen to ask you because one of my recent guests was Howard Schatz, who's also an underwater photographer, but a completely different kind. And I was wondering how you looked at his work, and if you're able to look at that and just start to read it, from a photography point of view, as in what he's done, or if you heard what he was saying and you could relate to some of it. I just wondered what your response was to Howard Schatz's work.
Well, I mean, I've known his work really through all my career. I think the first thing I would say about underwater photography is that underwater photography is often seen by the rest of photography as a very niche discipline. But in reality, underwater photography is a very diverse discipline. There's, everything from people who specialize in shooting, great whales, the biggest wildlife on the ocean, to people who specialize in photographing absolutely tiny animals underwater, people who photograph people underwater, activities underwater, and then people like Howard who create amazing visions working in controlled environments. So, it is it's everything from portraiture to landscape photography to architectural photography to natural history photography, all happen in underwater photography. So for me, it's a very diverse discipline. Specifically on Howard Schatz, his work I have adored through all my adult life and certainly all my underwater photography career. And I think of him as like a great chef, because he can take very simple ingredients and create the most amazing meal. It's like if I go to my cupboard in the kitchen, on like a Friday night, and there's no food left, and there's 2 tins of something old in there, I end up with a horrible meal. And Howard Schatz, you give to him a model, some water, and a bit of lighting, and he can create so many different dishes from those simple ingredients, and just the creativity of the man and the vision. So he's I think a fantastic example. But as a fan of photography, I love to look at the work of all sorts of photographers, because I think you can garner inspiration and ideas from all of them. But Howard has always been an ideas guy for me. I mean, it's just a fantastic example to all of us.
Yeah, I just think he's a genius. So looking through your website when I was preparing for this, particularly the portfolio section of the website, it's just so strong and so many extraordinary images, one after the other. And I'm reading the images from a photographer's point of view and a commercial photographer point of view, probably, where I'm always troubleshooting things and thinking, how do you do that? What lens were you using? What's the lighting doing? How do you get yourself in position for that? And I thought, to be just in the right place at the right time. So you've got challenges to overcome. You've got camera settings, lighting, diving expertise, which must take years and years to accumulate. And to be just in the right place at the right time, I can imagine you probably just have to have a really good understanding of the wildlife behaviour. So I figured, again, uneducated point of view here, there's just a lot of balls in the air. And I thought it's really impressive to have so many strong images with all those things to manage at the same time. So I'm really interested to unpack some of the specific shots with you. But first of all, I'm really always interested in people's timelines. So you said on your website that you started shooting underwater photos when you were 9. And I thought that's not what most 9-year-old kids are doing. So how did you get into underwater photography at such a young age?
Well, I was always fascinated by marine life, underwater life, from a child. My mum has a picture of me on a shelf in her house of me reading a book full of fish, and I'm like 2 years old. So it was always a passion of mine. And then growing up, whenever we went to a beach holiday and the water wasn't completely freezing, I would spend all day in the water just snorkeling, exploring, in single figures. And the family joke was we'd come back from holiday and my back and the back of my legs would be brown and the front of me would be completely white because I was head down in the water all day. And none of the rest of my family really shared that enthusiasm for the underwater world at all. And so with a passion for marine life and a family that didn't share that passion, I was drawn to photography simply as a way for sharing what I was seeing. And, I had this great passion. I would, come out the water going, I've seen this, I've seen that, I've seen the other. And that led me to want to record it. And so my early photography was all driven by a desire to communicate what I was seeing in the underwater world, specifically to my family. And in early days of underwater photography, I never expected to be a good photographer. I just simply wanted to be passable. It was very much a tool for that. But I guess starting so young and carrying on for such a long time, I slowly basically made every mistake there was possible to make. And by the time I was in my late teens, I really, had built up really quite a lot of experience and sort of knew what I was doing. And that kind of changed my approach to photography. I started to enter some competitions. I remember winning the Young Amateur Photographer magazine competition and going to their London HQ, and that was a very exciting day out. And actually, met some people that day who I still know to this day. It's kind of quite a strange thing. You'd think you'd meet people and, everyone would have moved on and things. So anyway, and then sort of slowly, began to have more success in specific underwater photography competitions. And by the time I finished my PhD in marine biology in my sort of early 20s, mid-20s, and began to earn some money working in research, I was then able to start to dive and photograph more widely and really build up a very strong portfolio because I already had the photo skills. So that's what kind of really sort of got me up to that level. But through all that period, I was very proudly an amateur photographer, very proud that I wasn't trying to earn money from it. And it was very much an artistic, a creative, a communication endeavor that really drew me in. And then in my late 20s, when I was 29, I decided at that time I was single. I didn't have any children, and I thought if I'm ever going to try this photography thing as a career, I should do it now when it seems that I won't be affecting anyone else too much. I'd kind of paid off student debts by then and things like that, and I was sort of, let's give this a go, and if after 18 months it's not working, I'll go back to a more sensible career. And thankfully, although those first few years were tough, there were signs that it would work. And then once I'd sort of been at it 3 or 4 years, by sort of my mid-30s, I was sort of pretty, pretty stable within in knowing how it would work. And then, like any career, particularly these days, that ability to be flexible. So I think, no business has the same business model now that we did 10 years ago. Yeah. And I've always sort of been looking for areas that I can adapt the business. And I very much I think that's people often ask me about, how do you go pro, in photography? And I always remind people that the pro is the pro in profit. You need to find a way of operating that doesn't just earn you money, but actually it keeps you in the black. You're having more money coming in than's going out, and you're using your photographic talents, your experience and knowledge to do that. So that's kind of how I've weaved my career together.
Yeah. And so those early couple of years, what did that look like? I mean, we can know things have changed, but what was it like when you started out in terms of the business?
It was tough. I mean, I was coming out of a science career, so I was working in a university, and as a junior sort of scientist, you don't get paid loads of money by universities. So I set myself the challenge that within 18 months I had to be earning the same as a business that I was getting as a salary from the company, and that was the goal I set myself. And it had to be not just 1 month; it had to be every month. I had to be getting to that level. And I decided a year before finishing my university contract, I actually told my boss, I want to finish this contract, but I don't want to renew. I don't want to stay in the university. I want to give this a go. And I said, but please don't tell everyone else in the department yet, because otherwise, everyone would just cut me out of every bit of work, and my career will grind to a halt. But I said, I want to do this at the end of the year. So, but I spent that year building up a bit of money, building up contacts, building up plans. It's easier to say, this time next year, could I do this job for you, than saying, I really need money, can you pay me now? So I managed to get a few things set up. And that then left me in a pretty good place. But I learned a lot of hard lessons, and just like in my photography education, I think I probably made just about every mistake that's possible to make in those early years. But also, had bits of luck, had fortunately some good competition successes around that time that really gave me opportunities. And specifically, I mean, definitely, actually, I listened to your interview with Howard Schatz because I'm a big fan of his work, and he made a fantastic analogy about how each sort of bit of competition success, each gallery exhibition, each big published article is another brick in your castle, but it's also always falling down. And I think during that period I had a lot of bricks come together, and it just got me up and running really nicely. And a piece of sort of serendipity about that time is it just so happened, completely through luck, that around that time the world of photography was switching from film to digital. And in underwater photography, that was a massive game changer, because you know, it sounds really prosaic, but you can't change film underwater. So for years, underwater photographers were limited to 36 pictures, and suddenly we weren't. Also, underwater photography is predominantly flash photography, And the challenge of using flash, and particularly multiple flashes, in the underwater environment is a steep one, because you're trying to control lots of light that you can't see, and that light can also light up not only the subject but loads of particles in the water that you don't want to light up, and that makes lighting underwater pictures difficult. The moment you could see your results as you shot them, suddenly we could add a level of finesse just technically to underwater pictures we never could before, and it meant that the very best pictures taken 5 years earlier were very easy to surpass. I would say not the really iconic work. The really incredible work has remained incredible. But I would say the average good, publishable, solid shot was suddenly being surpassed very easily. So it was kind of a little bit of a reset on the market, the arrival of digital. And I was at a very good age to want to adopt all of those ideas. Yeah. I mean, I have to say that the majority of my underwater photography awards are actually still from the film era. Right. I kind of also sort of stopped entering the specific underwater photography contests around that time. But, so I was very much a film photographer, but was well placed to make that early leap to digital. And that definitely made a big difference in getting my career up and running.
I've always wanted to ask someone what it's like to be in the water with a blue whale, because I've seen, footage, photographs, and it just seems to me like it would be quite a mix of emotions to be in there. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so can you talk a little bit about your experience with blue whales?
Yes, blue whales, it sounds silly to say, but blue whales are really big. And it sounds funny because actually a lot of whales are not all that big. Right. They're a scale up from a lot of the other whales. Humpback whales are a big whale. The minke whales that you see quite a bit off the west coast of Scotland, they're big whales, but they're not so huge. They're kind of maybe a couple of cars. You kind of feel like, okay, it's just a big animal. Mm-hmm. The blue whale is sort of another scale again. Unfortunately, though, photographically, they're not the easiest species to work with, because some whales, and I'd say particularly humpback whales, when they're calving, in particular, the calves don't really swim, and the mothers just float about with the calves a lot of the time, and they have sort of some elaborate social behaviours that also mean that they're actually a whale that stays still a lot, which means you can get in the water with them and spend time with them. Sperm whales, they can be quite curious about them. So with the sperm whale, you get in the water, you get away from your boat, and you hope to pique the sperm whale's curiosity, and they may come over to you. Blue whales, they're just feeding and moving, feeding and moving, feeding and moving. So the way you get in them is you basically get ahead of them, go in the water, get the boat away, and hope they come past you. Mm-hmm. And so you only ever get a flyby, but with the blue whale, really, they never stop. So you don't get a feeling of a connection with them that you might get with some of the other whale species. But the size of them and is just mind-boggling. They're quite a difficult species to work with, because in order to get close to them, you need to use very small boats with very small engines, because the big engines make lots of noise, and you want to be as silent as possible. So we use very, very quiet engines on very lightweight boats, which means we can have to wait to really perfect sea conditions, because you can't go around chasing them, because you need to be able to go fast to get ahead of them, because you want to be able to get in well ahead of them. And blue whales, even swimming slowly, move very quickly because they're just so big. And so you're going out into the open ocean. We were, when last time I was photographing them, we were 30, 40 miles from land in a boat that's 12 feet long. So you feel quite exposed out in all this, and the boats go, because it's so light, it skips along the surface of the ocean. But even with the tiny waves, it's the most juddering ride. So it's a very physical thing. And then the boat, it gets well ahead of the whale, but it wants to keep you want to get the boat away from the whale. So you basically jump in off a moving boat and then go down underwater and hold your breath for as long as you possibly can without, but jumping off a moving boat is very physical. So it's a very physical activity, because the moment you go in the water off a moving boat, your body stops, but the boat keeps moving, so you get smashed up on the way in. But you then go down and hold your breath for as long as you can, and hopefully by about the time you're about to run out of air, which is, about maybe a minute and a half later, something huge starts materializing in front of you, and then you get the chance to photograph them. But very often you run out of air and no whale appears, and because you got the line up a little bit wrong. But it's this mix of physically very hard work, which is quite unusual in underwater photography. Normally underwater it's very calm and relaxed. It's physically very hard, with incredible highs and incredible lows where you think you're about to get something amazing. But something that, and then with just moments of photography opportunity. That is something I think that runs throughout all underwater photography, and the blue whale is maybe an extreme example of it, is that the environment that I choose to take photos in is not one that I can survive in without special equipment. It's not one that I can spend unlimited time in. And time is a incredibly limiting factor in underwater photography. It has elements of sports photography where you have moments to get pictures, and you don't have repeated opportunities because you're working with wild subjects in an environment where you can't spend time. So it suits a photographer who is decisive and is technically adept in their discipline, so that they can make the most of those opportunities across all underwater photography, because the time is always a limitation. So that's something I both enjoy and find a frustration of it. There are, of course, many advantages in underwater photography, and the fact that we are in an environment that not many people see. So the majority of what we point our camera at has a natural interest. We are free to move in 3 dimensions. So in the same way that, sort of landscape photography has been revolutionized by drones, just giving an alternative viewpoint on many subjects, we've always had that underwater. We've been free to swim above a subject, swim below a subject, swim alongside a subject, and shoot. And those things make it really, really interesting. It also throws up this whole mix of subject matter, which I think I find really enjoyable as well, in that it's not it's about multiple lenses, it's about multiple viewpoints, it's about multiple techniques. But it's also united by the fact that you can't take underwater photos unless you're very close to things. And that generally means you do come away with a real connection with your subjects. If you're able to put a big telephoto lens on as a wildlife photographer and shoot animals, 50 meters away, then, of course you get to photograph them, and maybe they never knew you were there, and that's fantastic. As an underwater photographer, we have to take pictures pretty much at arm's length from everything we shoot. Yeah. And that means that most of the time our subjects do know we're there, but we have to approach them in a way that means that they're totally cool with that. Now, the good side of underwater photography is that most wildlife has no fear of people. So unlike wildlife on land, you can't just walk up to a rabbit in the park and take a picture of it because it'll run away. Underwater, you can swim up slowly to wildlife, and as long as you behave in the right way, you will be rewarded with a nice encounter. So the positive side of that close interaction is you come away with very rich experiences from the underwater world. But you don't ever get that chance really to observe things without them knowing you're there. They just have to accept that you're there and carry on with their lives.
On that point of shooting close, so if you have something really large like a blue whale, how close are you needing to be there to get to be as close as you can, but also get the whole animal in the frame?
So the answer to that question is that's the reason why we use fisheye lenses underwater as one of our main go-to lenses, because we need the ability to shoot as big a subject as possible from as close as possible, in order that we can get as much detail and colour and clarity on the subject. If we shoot through too much water, it all just gets lost in the murk. We're able to use heavily distorting fisheye lenses because we're dealing with environments that don't have a lot of straight lines, and also with a bit of practice you get very used to composing pictures that hide a lot of that distortion. If it's your main go-to lens, you become very good at putting a picture together. And I have to say, you asked what the experience of shooting the blue whales is like, and I think the underwater photographer in some ways is the worst person to ask, because for me, it was F8 at a 500th and ISO 600, 640 or whatever. And that's where my brain was, not in, wow, how amazing this is. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but because I do believe as certainly for my photography, I try and live the experience too, because it makes my photos better.
Yeah.
If I've had that emotional connection with the experience with the subject, I'll pour that into the image making, and the image will be more memorable as a result. But I have to say, I'm also slightly detached, because my brain is spinning through all the other things that, in the fraction of seconds that you've got when the blue whale appears to when it's gone, you've got to also make sure you nail things technically, because that's not an opportunity that comes around very regularly.
Yeah, no, I totally relate to that, because from my own wildlife experiences, mainly with safari, and we went with a group, and there was 4 photographers, and there was one spouse. And I just thought that this non-photographer in the group was having the best experience, because they were not experiencing it with a box in front of their face. I wasn't sure which way to go at this interview, and I was kind of wary of it just being me asking you about what it's like to photograph different sea creatures, but I'm going to ask you about a couple more.
I'm fine with that. I could, you tried to shut me up. I'm pretty passionate about most things that live in the ocean. So
yeah, I was thinking, with the great whites, it must be a completely different experience than with the one that we've just spoken about with the blue whales. And I saw on your website you're running a workshop off of Mexico on an amazing looking boat. I can't see that ever not being a thrill. What's it like being in the water with the great white sharks?
So sharks are a fantastic subject for underwater photography, but actually quite a challenging one, because they are one of the few species that have a little bit of wariness about being close to other big animals in the water, and including people. Also, we've been fishing sharks at a ridiculous rate for at least the last 100 years. And we have removed a huge percentage of many of the species out of the ocean. And so it makes sharks really quite hard to find. And you really, I end up traveling to incredibly remote places, because the places that are remote for fishermen are also the places where the wildlife can still thrive. Right. So, we go to some pretty, far off places to finally be able to get ourselves in front of sharks. I've photographed the majority of the well-known species of sharks around the world, and the great whites are the only ones that I choose to use a cage for. So most of the sharks, we're very relaxed, free swimming with them, being in the water with them, working with local naturalists who know that particular population and have figured out a very safe way to have safe interactions with them. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, we're trying to get within touching distance to get those good underwater photos. Yeah. And the great whites are, I think, partly because of the environment in which we choose to interact with them, it's also technically easier to do it from inside a cage. And it makes certainly running a workshop a lot less stressful as a workshop leader, because you might not get paid if you don't bring them all back. Yeah. So it's the funny thing is about the cage photography is when you are in the cage, you do feel very, very secure, and it allows you to really focus on the experience and focus on the photography. And I do like that aspect of it. Now, you can free swim with white sharks, and I wouldn't really have any real concerns about doing so. But if I did that, it's very much the photo is then of me free swimming with the shark, not the shark. Yeah. Within the cage, I feel I'm able to focus more on capturing this incredible ocean predator, and the story being about him or her, as it often is, or her, as opposed to the story being about me. And I think going outside the cage, you make yourself the story, whereas when you're in the cage, you can make the animal the story. So for that, and from a safety of not losing guests point of view, I like the cage experience. Cage photography is probably a little bit, for a non-underwater photographer, it's probably an area of underwater photography that's quite similar to nature photography on land, particularly like using a hide, in that you go in the cage and you wait for the animals to appear. So most of the time underwater, we go underwater and we're shooting the whole time we're down there, because there's amazing scenery, and even if the key species doesn't turn up, there's nearly always something interesting to take a photo of. Cage photography is very much in the cage, in your hide, and wait. I think one thing people are quite surprised about when they see the cages is that the holes in the cage are usually big enough for the sharks to come in. They're more of a box that allows you to stay still, and the sharks don't want to come in. But if you make the holes too small, there's no space to get cameras out of them, and it's often safer to have a cage that if the shark did put its nose in, it would end up being able to go in and through, as opposed to go in and get stuck. So they usually actually think people arrive on the shark boats thinking, oh great, I'm going to be in this, completely protected area.
Yeah.
But actually most of the cages we use are more like a metal frame. So you've got a barrier that you can be behind. But if the shark wanted to get in, it could do. But the sharks are not at all interested in eating the people. They're interested in the bait.
Yeah, I was wondering if they even associate people as food.
I've dived with lots of sharks around the world, and I've never seen any shark, in my experience, wanting to do anything to any person in the water. They do, though, learn to associate, boats that feed sharks, for example, to provide bait to bring them in. They definitely know when the boat turns up that means there might be some food soon. So they make those connections. So I think you have to be very careful, and the naturalists who run these trips need to be very careful about that association, that the sharks associate the boat with this, but no one goes in the cage and starts giving food out of the cage to the shark.
Yeah.
You use food to attract them into the area. But also, certainly from my perspective, we don't want to get photos of great white sharks eating bait. We want to get photos of great white sharks, and we just, with that particular species, need to use some bait to pull them into photographic range. So it's that's kind of the motivation.
Yeah, I would find it quite interesting on safari. Like a lion can walk right past the car, often does. I mean, right past, and I just don't think they associate. Like they're not seeing. They can see people in the car, but they're not seeing that there's food there. But I just wonder. I always think if you step onto the ground there, they probably would eat you because you're you're sort of in their territory. But I just think they must have a safe association with the vehicles that are, so they see them every day in the safari.
Yeah, I would say that the sharks are a little bit different in that. The risk for any predator, speaking as a biologist now, is you want to eat without risking getting injured. If you're a herbivore and you get injured, you've got a good chance of recovering. If you're a predator and you get injured, you're dead.
Right.
And so all predators are very careful about hunting things and hunting in a way that minimizes their risk to themselves as well as getting the food they need to eat. And for most sharks that have any clue about us, they don't know what we are, we're potentially dangerous, and we're not particularly nourishing. And for those reasons, it really makes very little sense. So generally sharks, from a biological point of view, the only attacks you get on people are mistaken identity. Where they think it's something else because of the conditions. So it means that when you're with a shark in those environments, they don't see you. They see you potentially maybe a rival for the food source. But sharks are generally pretty good at working together in that respect, because they often come together in aggregations, and because they don't want to get injured, they signal to each other. So great whites, when they want to signal to each other, two great whites will swim together in parallel. And that way they can measure each other up against each other in terms of length and breadth and everything to avoid having to have a confrontation. Right. And so they're not aggressive to each other, and they're not going to hunt something that they don't know what it is, because there's a risk of injury without good food reward. And we're not particularly nourishing compared to a seal or a tuna because we don't have a lot of nice muscle, or we don't have a lot of nice fat. So we're not, we're mainly skin and bone, and that doesn't. I mean, not that the sharks know that, but they can, they're well aware that we don't make a good food source. So they're not naturally trying to predate things. I think the lion is a little bit different in that lions know what humans are, and they've, they've been encounters with them. But for the same reason, lions as predators are unlikely to want to attack someone for those same basic sort of rules of biology, that as a predator, if you get injured, that's the end of your life. And so you've got to be very careful. And in the ocean, animals don't have hands. They can't grab something and, or claws or something. They have to basically bite into things, whether you're a great white shark or whether you're a tiny little, goby living in a rock pool, you have to feed on things that you can deal with just your mouth. So most of the time, species feed on other species in the ocean that are a lot smaller than them. So the fact that we're we're smaller than a great white shark, but we're of a comparable size, means we're not necessarily really in their predator range. They a lot of the places the great white sharks are feeding on seal and sea lion pups, which are actually the size of a small dog. They're not the size of a big human. So we're also kind of the wrong scale, and so it's not really. But that said, I'll always defer to the knowledge of the local naturalist, and my attitude with any of the more dangerous animals in the ocean is you don't want to be being brave to take photos of them. You instead want to work with the experts, make sure you understand how the interaction is going to work, ask all your questions beforehand, so that when you get in the water, there's no need to be brave. You're simply following a well thought out process.
Yeah.
I know it doesn't sound, it's not the the Indiana Jones adventure style photography, but actually that's the way to be able to have safe encounters that are both safe for you and the animal, and to allow you to focus on your photography and create the really special images.
Yeah. And so I suppose even with the safety, which obviously you do, still seeing those guys coming towards you out of the murk must just always be a thrill.
Oh yeah, and the great white shark is one of those species that it looks exactly like it does in the movies, and it really does. You the first time you see one, it's like it looks just like it does in the documentary. It looks just like it does it. They really do look like that. And sometimes, you go and see something in the wild and it looks different from how you maybe imagined it. If you've seen wildlife, for example, in a zoo and you go on safari, the animals look shinier and their coats are in better condition. They don't look quite like the same species, whereas great white sharks look the same in film as they do, when you see them, and the way they come out of the blue. So you're looking and the sea's empty, and then suddenly is that a shape, and then suddenly it's a great white shark. That experience is exactly as it is on film, except it's there in front of you. And I remember, we lean out of the cages to photograph them. And I remember one time I was out of the cage photographing one, and the shark turned towards me and starts coming close to me. And I'm looking through my fisheye lens, so it looks a long way away, but it really isn't. And I'm shooting away, and I pull myself back inside the cage, and I catch my head on the roof of the cage, and it flips my face mask strap off. So my face mask falls off. So I've got this great white shark bearing down on me. My face mask has come off. I can see, kind of now everything blurry. I'm used to being underwater without a face mask, so that side of it doesn't panic me or worry me. And I have an air supply, so I just keep breathing. But I've gone back inside the cage. My face mask is full of, and I just sort of go down as a little ball and hide behind the railings while I search for my thing. Still clutching my camera, of course.
I wanted to ask about something which I, again, thought would be a completely different approach for you, but with coral reefs. And I saw one of the things on your site. Is a location, is it Missole? I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Yes,
Missole, yes.
And I suppose, is that more like you're going looking to see what's there rather than having one specific thing, and like we've been talking about with the previous subjects?
Yes, and I would say that's true of a lot of natural history underwater photography. Is we tend to go to, because there's so much diversity of life in the ocean. If you go up onto up into the Cairngorms or something, you might go to the hilltops and see deer and mountain hares, and maybe in the forest you might get a capercaillie or something. But it's very, or grouse or whatever. You've got very specific subjects you're going for. The coral reef environment is both incredibly diverse and incredibly densely populated. So even if you just went in looking for one species, you would see 50 on the way to it. So as a result, we tend to, just because we're used to being overwhelmed by this diversity, we go to destinations that are particularly rich with the intention that we can really shoot lots of different things. And that makes it a lot of fun for a workshop, because people can all go on a workshop and come back with totally different pictures from each other, which I think works well. The very best places to go, unsurprisingly, are also often incredibly remote, and Missole is as remote a spot as I know in the ocean. And you fly to Indonesia, you then fly on fairly rickety local planes 3 hours across Indonesia to very remote areas. You turn up at small port really in the middle of jungle covered islands, and then from there you go 6 hours out into the sea to a tiny, tiny island. You know,
Right.
half an hour from the port, you go past the very remote islands that they go to film the Birds of Paradise, and we go straight past those and go to a place that makes those feel like on the mainstream. And we go way out to Missoula Eco Resort, is a resort right at the end of an island chain, at the end of an island, at the end of the world. It really is, you know, it really is incredibly remote. And what is, I think, amazing about that place is that the area is an incredible coral reef environment, but through ecotourism, they've funded a properly patrolled and protected marine protected area. And one of the things we're struggling with all across the world at the moment is protecting the ocean properly. And the first stage to that is designating areas as protected areas, but then they actually need to be properly enforced, and that's what we're kind of struggling with, you know, certainly in the Western world at the moment. But what they've done here is through ecotourism is they're properly protecting and patrolling this area of the ocean. And the effect on the marine life has just been staggering. When I first went there, you know, which was 15 years ago now, I didn't see a shark on the whole trip. You go back there now, and within 15 years, the shark numbers are, you know, every dive you see sharks. The mantas there, I think there's 8 or 9 times as many manta rays as there was 10, 15 years ago.
Wow.
The reefs are packed with fish because no one's fishing there. It is incredible how resilient and how the ocean can bounce back when it's properly protected. And it's a lesson that we should be taking on board across all the oceans, because actually that's what our oceans need. And it's the same around our own coast. If we properly protected parts of the ocean, we protected them from destructive activities by people, it would allow the oceans to flourish, and it would also mean that the activities that we need to do, like fishing and other things in the ocean, in the surrounding areas, would actually be all the more rich. And it just needs that step change in the way we manage things, and it would be miles better for the wildlife, and it would be miles better for us as well. And Missoula is a place that just totally convinces you of that. And so for me, it's just a remarkable place to visit, and it is colour. It's life. You know, if you go to a rainforest, people go, "Oh, rainforest, it's diverse." You walk around a rainforest and you just see green for hours. On a coral reef, you put your head underwater and there's movement and colour and diversity of shape and form and types of animals everywhere you look for the whole time you're there. And they're not scared of you. They're all in your face the whole time. And it is, as a wildlife experience, for me, it's the ultimate wildlife experience you can have on the planet. It's not, you know, is it better than, you know, you can go on a game dive in the best parks in Africa and you can have a quiet morning. On a coral reef, there is wildlife to see all the time. Yeah. And then on top of that, you get these incredible A-list animals turning up with regularity in the parts of the ocean that are, you know, are safe and far away from human activity and properly protected. And Missoula is the absolute epitome of that.
So when you go to a coral reef like that, life everywhere, so many things to look at. Where do you start? How do you even find a starting point with that?
Well, I think that for me, it starts again with trying to promote that emotional reaction. I think when you're dealing with natural history subjects, you as a photographer want your emotions to drive your photography. So underwater photography is a very technical discipline. You have to, use equipment in very specific ways to be able to take pictures through even when it's at its clearest, water is incredibly impenetrable to light. And as photographers, that's our currency, is light. So we always need to be aware of our technical constraints, but it makes underwater photographers can fall into the trap of becoming very technical photographers without their pictures having soul, having gesture, having feeling. And so I like to let my emotional reaction to that environment, really drive my photography. Right. What is it that is just knocking my socks off? What is it that I really want to say to my audience about this place? And in a place like Missoula, it's just this explosion of life and colour. Now, the challenge photographically then is that explosions of light, of colour and movement are usually quite messy, and messy pictures aren't necessarily that attractive. So you're often then tempering that in with photographic decisions to allow this story to play out in an image that the viewer can still connect to. And I guess like a landscape photographer, spending, a week in the field, you're spending your whole time looking at amazing scenery, but you're crafting images from it. So you're finding areas that allow you to tell that emotional story in a still picture. Mm-hmm. And that involves, the intricacies of the technique, the intricacies of vision, the intricacies of trying to weave all that together in a particular place. So, for example, to get some specific stuff for anyone who's interested, we shoot a lot with fisheye lenses. Fisheye lenses, the central area of the image tends to dominate compositionally. So we need to give the lens, the viewer, something in that central area for them to latch onto. Otherwise, the whole picture can feel like background. Mm-hmm. We're also limited in underwater photography that because we need to use flash in our pictures, we need to have a foreground subject that's really going to begin to tell the story. And then we need to put into that picture background elements that can work technically in underwater photography terms and don't just end up as a kind of a green-blue mush. Mm-hmm. They actually have some impact and start to pull out. So there's quite a lot of technical considerations to go into it. But through all of that, I'm always reminding myself, what is it that's really exciting me about this area, this scene. Mm-hmm. I think the other part of underwater photography is we tell that story across a whole range of sizes, from the big landscape scenic shots all the way down to microscopic animals. And for example, in Mosul, it's an incredible place for pygmy seahorses, which are a species, or it's a group of seahorses that are absolutely tiny. They are a centimetre fully stretched out, and they live disguised, living in sea fans. So a sea fan is like a fan. It's an animal that filters water from the filters particles from the water and grows into a fan shape to do so. And the pygmy seahorses live in the little gaps between the branches, and they are coloured the same as the sea fan. So they're incredibly adapted to their habitat, incredibly secretive. But just the most remarkable species. And on the same, dive, the same location that you are shooting these, adrenaline pumping, coral reef on steroids scenic pictures, you're also getting out super high magnification lens and telling the story of a tiny inhabitant that lives in that environment, and then trying to tell stories on every level in between. Because I think with an environment like that, it's not going to be captured in a single image. It's about building a portfolio to tell that story.
I need to ask you on behalf of my daughter. She's 5. She really is into Titanic. She loves it, and she loves.
A little deep for me, that one, but yeah.
But she was asking me, how many shipwrecks have you been to?
So lots and lots, and for me, shipwrecks are a really interesting area of underwater photography because they're a totally different challenge from wildlife. So I've been to shipwrecks all around the world, and in my early days of underwater photography, I used to resent going to see shipwrecks, and I would generally just put a lens on so I could shoot wildlife there because that was my passion. Mm-hmm. But over time, I've realised how fascinating they are on so many levels. There's tragedy associated with them. There's human story. There's human history. A wreck that I photograph a great deal in Egypt is a British Second World War transport ship that was taking military supplies to North Africa. And it's like an underwater museum. It's full of more than 100 military motorbikes, more than 60 trucks and lorries. And you can dive through these holes and see all these vehicles. And they are not easy to photograph because they're in a murky, silty environment, and you're poking around through these subjects, trying to figure out what they are and find angles that make them photographically accessible, and you can technically pull them off. So that aspect is, I think, really, really interesting, and you have the chance to tell very different stories from natural history stories. But yeah, all around the world there are wrecks. I think because we're kind of it's now just coming to being the Second World War was a little bit long ago. So a lot of ships were sunk during the Second World War, and those Second World War wrecks have been over the last sort of, after they'd been underwater for about 30 years, they had about sort of 50 years before the metal had begun to rust too much, when the marine life really coated them and they were incredible to dive. A lot of them now are coming to the end of that, where they're beginning to rust to the point that they're beginning to disintegrate, and they're not as exciting to dive as perhaps they were a little while ago. But it very much depends on how well they were made and how they were sunk and where they've ended up. But there are a lot of really fascinating wrecks, and it's something that you can experience all around the world. And it's one thing that sort of really struck me and reminds you how much of a global conflict the Second World War was, is the fact that, you know, I've dived Second World War wrecks from northern Norway right down to the South Pacific. And, you know, it really reminds you, goodness me, you know, these huge ships full of, you know, really large numbers of people, you know, were sunk all around the world. And it's you know, they are real monuments to all of that. They also, you know, from a photography point of view, they're a lot of fun to shoot, because just because something can't move doesn't make it easy to shoot. And I think you have the chance to play around with really interesting techniques in those environments.
Yeah, it looks to me like the first thing I think of, it just looks kind of eerie and spooky, and, you know, approaching it would you'd be approaching it with some trepidation. And then when I look at the photography, you know, the way that you're using lighting, I was wondering if you have another diver with you who's directing the light from another location, or can you leave a light down somewhere? I don't understand how that works.
Yeah, so generally, I do most of those shots working on my own. I think that's more just of a practical thing. I think if my photography was lucrative enough that I could have assistants doing that sort of thing, it would be fantastic. But sadly, the economies of being an underwater photographer mean that I'm generally doing being my own lighting assistant. I think also there's so much of the creativity comes from the lighting in those shots that it's something that as a photographer you really want control of, because that's where you're pouring in your creative juices and making the image really yours. So I've spent a lot of time developing gear and gizmos to be able to make those types of shots in those environments. And the challenge you have as an underwater photographer is that you need to have stuff that's reliable and works and is practical, but is also not so big that you can't carry it around, because ultimately you've got to carry everything with you, and weight's not the issue. But you can't go inside a wreck with stuff hanging off you like a Christmas tree. You're not going to be able to squeeze inside the wreck. So there are limitations on those shots. But that's what makes it fun, and I think that's what leaves you with with pictures that are not easy to be emulated. People, so they're eye-catching imagery, and they're also real moments in time, because the effort gone into them is not easy to repeat.
So is that the kind of thing you could go down there with something quite specific in mind and try and put it together?
Yes, yeah, and those wrecks, they're not moving. You learn over time how the light will be, because shipwrecks don't move, but the sun moves. So certain aspects of shipwrecks take sun, take light, are illuminated inside by shafts of light. At different times of the day and in different conditions with the tide, and so you sort of build up that knowledge over time, and you quite quickly on the different wrecks around the world know, this is a wreck that's great to dive in the morning, this one's great in midday, this one's great in the evening. Actually, I like to dive this wreck at 3 times in the day because I love how the light moves around it. And so that's kind of a big part of it. As you go deeper, the time of day becomes less important, because when you're shallow in the ocean, there's much more of a direction to the ambient light. When you go deeper, the murkiness of the water kind of takes that direction out of it, and the water is just like, it's like if you have a light bulb on in the room and you haven't got a shade on it, or you put kind of a big soft round box on it. That's the difference of going deeper, really. You lose that direction, you lose the strength of the shadows. And actually, for a lot of the wrecks, the shallower they are, the more interesting they are in terms of how they take the light. And the deeper they are, usually the better condition they are and the better the artifacts. So sometimes you want to go deep, sometimes you want to stay shallow.
This season, the Gear Round is sponsored by the good people at MPB, where you can buy, sell and trade camera gear. Okay, so what's your go-to camera and lens combination for underwater photography?
So I have 2 main cameras at the moment, but the one I use the most is a Nikon D850. I'm still in the SLR world rather than switching over to mirrorless. I also have a Nikon D5, which is probably my second camera at the moment. And I use a whole variety of lenses with that. So I have a lot of, but underwater lenses generally fall into wide-angle lenses, and by that I mean ultra-wide-angle lenses, and macro lenses, close-focusing macro lenses. Right. But because we have to take all our pictures from the same distance, usually touching distance, we want a variety of optics to give us a variety of picture areas. So we can use some zoom lenses, but ultimately we're tending to optimize for particular shots on particular underwater excursions, whether it's snorkeling or diving, and then looking for subjects that suit that particular lens. Okay. And if we find something else, it's better to come back another time, another day with the right lens than try and force something with the wrong lens. So because we obviously can't open our camera and change lenses underwater, just to anyone's confused about that.
So okay. And so I was wondering, what's the 850 giving you over the D5? Is it the resolution?
Yes, so in the previous generation, and the reason I own a D5 is that in the previous generation, when the D4 and the D800 were announced, I'm a Nikon guy, I shot them both back to back on a trip and concluded to myself that for my needs the D4 was perfect and the D800, I didn't really need the resolution, and I actually preferred the D4 files. So when the D5 was announced, I just thought, it's going to be more of the same. I'm going to buy a D5 and I don't even need to test the other camera because I don't really need the resolution for what I do. I'm more of a stock editorial photographer than doing fine art or big prints. And I think underwater pictures shot really well tend to print really big irrespective of the resolution of the camera, and underwater pictures shot badly with a high resolution camera don't print well. Okay. So it was I was very happy with the resolution. However, the first workshop that I ran that someone bought a D850 on the trip, it occurred to me almost instantly that the D850 files were better than the D5 files in terms of their adjustability, their suitability for underwater subjects, which really surprised me because it was the opposite of what I found with the D800. And so at that point I realised that I wanted to shoot a D850 as well. The other motivation behind it is that the camera world seems to show no sign of stopping the march to ever more high resolution files. And I'm also aware of the future proofing of my own work in that, you can only put so many pixels on a piece of paper, particularly in a magazine. However, I am concerned that if clients get so used to everyone always sending them 50 megapixel files, if you in 15 years' time turn around and say, here's my 20 megapixel file, they might go, oh no, this is not usable, even though it is. And I felt that the D850, because the nature of my work takes me all around the world, and there are destinations that maybe I only visit once every 10 years, and I want my stock of that destination to be as valuable at the end of the 10 years as it is at the beginning. And so I felt the D850 gives me a little bit of future-proofing from the fickle nature of the market. Now, I've never ever had anyone have any issue with any picture I've taken, and I still have pictures from 6 megapixel digital cameras, which at the time everyone told me I was wasting my time with and I should be shooting film still. They still get published all the time, so I have I've never come against this, but I just also felt it was a good way to go. But I'm less concerned, as underwater photographers, the camera is one of the least important parts of the gear. It's actually the lenses we use that allow that camera to work properly underwater, the lighting we use, and the housing that allows you to access that camera properly. Those are the really key components of my gear.
Okay. And so with the housing, what kind of housing do you use?
So I use housings from a small company in Austria called Subal, who make housings specifically for each camera. And they have an engineering and design philosophy that I love. Their stuff is not particularly flashy looking, but it's super strong, super reliable, and it's got really, really great ergonomics. And I know that I've got photos with my gear that people with maybe less ergonomic gear will have missed. And I'm also, like any system, I'm invested into that system, so I have all the adapters and things to make it work with all the different lenses that I want to use. And actually, as underwater photographers, we use a lot of lenses. So although I was saying we kind of use wide angle and macro, there's probably 4 different macro lenses that I use, and I use those also with a lot of accessories that I can screw onto them underwater. And I also have, I think, 5 or 6 different wide-angle lenses that I'm using regularly, just to give me different perspectives, different zoom ranges, different looks to my pictures. So, although underwater photography seems quite simple, and it is, particularly when you're trying to expand the look of your work, it's good to work a variety of different focal lengths.
With the housing, I think when you said ergonomics, it just hit me. I was like, well, that's got to be the absolute key for the whole thing, for the housing. You have to be able to do the settings adjustments that you need to do easily. And presumably you've got gloves on when you're diving, right?
It depends on the temperature. So actually, it's important that the housing can work, when it's really cold, like, when we're allowed back in the water here in England next week, the water's going to be maybe 8-9 degrees. And 8-9 degree water after half an hour, your hands are pretty much numb. So you need a housing that can work with that. But then when I'm diving in the tropics, I can dive in my swimming trunks and I'm never cold. Mm-hmm. And in those conditions, I'm never going to wear gloves. I've got completely different dexterity levels. So you need a housing that's designed for both. Mm-hmm. And it is really important. I have to say, though, that it's an area that the housing manufacturers, not just my particular one, but all of them have put a lot of work into over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, it was about, here's a waterproof box that you can just about use your camera through. Now, I would say that there's features on my housing that have better ergonomics than the camera body. We use ISO a lot. Most of the housings now, rather than it being a button you have to press, they actually have a specialist lever that just falls naturally underneath your thumb. Again, for reviewing images, we have a nice lever that's just under your thumb. You don't have to go and find a button on the back of the camera. So they can prioritize the controls that we need to be really at your fingertips. I have on my D5, if I pull back with both my top two fingers, that takes me a picture without flash. If I pull back with just one finger, it takes me a picture with flash. So there's lots of neat little ergonomic fixes that are on the housings that actually enhance the photographic material. And when I teach photography, if when I talk to, you need to close the aperture for that shot, I always move my hand like that because that's how you close an aperture on the gear on the housing. And the shutter speed, it's a dial on the back, so that slows down my shutter speed, that speeds it up. And I just make those, I move those when I talk. Everyone always jokes, I can see you're an underwater photographer because you close your aperture like that and you open it like this, and and that's the control of the housing. So I'm used to using my camera in a housing, not out of it.
Yeah, that's so great that they've gone to the care to do that, though, and it can make it work for you rather than having it work against you. It must make it so much easier. I was curious to ask about filters as well. I know you've got magic filters, which I think you invented. Am I right?
Yes, a long time ago now. 15 years ago. Yeah.
So what's the role for filters in underwater photography?
So I probably should have said this earlier on, but the reason we need to use flash underwater is that light doesn't just become attenuated as it goes down and gets darker very quickly underwater. It's also the different wavelengths of light get absorbed at very different rates. So in clear blue water, you run out of red light, you lose 75% of red light by the time you get to the depth of your feet. So if you take a picture without flash, it very quickly becomes a monochromatic blue. The solution to that we usually do as underwater photographers is we take flash guns down with us to restore the white light. It's like a fill flash, but we're filling not just with detail but also with colour. A filter is an alternative way of correcting that colour balance. So the camera's white balance adjustment can do some of that, but we're talking about a much bigger colour cast than the cameras are usually tuned to deal with. So we add a filter to the camera that does 80% of the work, and then the white balance can do the fine tuning. And what was different about the filter I invented, it was very much invented for digital cameras. So before then, people had made filters that completely corrected for seawater. But these could only work at one depth, because you could correct for seawater at 5 meters depth, or you could correct for seawater at 10 meters depth. What I realized with the magic filter is that, having tried the filters that existed and realized that they were impractical, was that I made a filter that did 80% of the work, but didn't restrict you from using it either right at the surface all the way down to about 15 meters, because it did the work that the camera couldn't do and left the camera to do the work it could do. And so that filter allows you to shoot in certain places very nicely without flash. Now, a lot of the time, I would say I only use it for a small proportion of my photography, because it's particularly suited for certain subject matter, and actually that kick of flash gives a lot to a lot of photos. So I would say I'd still take probably 90% of my photos with flash underwater. But when there are certain situations, big schools of fish, big coral landscapes, big shipwrecks, these are really well suited to filter photography, and it's really enhanced my portfolio. And I would never have, I just developed it for myself. And I didn't have, particularly strong commercial ideas at that time. But a friend of mine who was helping me develop it, Peter Rowlands, I came up with two formulas, and I said, well, I'm going to test this one and you test the other one. And the one I gave him to test actually turned out to be better than the one I thought was going to be best. And after we did that, he suggested that we made it commercially available. And I was like, I was just going to, publish what I did and let people make it for themselves. And he was like, no, we should get this made and we could sell it to people. So that's where the business side of it came from. And I'm really glad he did that, because although it's never made us lots of money, it provided a nice trickle of money at a time in my photographic career where a trickle of regular money each month was more valuable than a big lump sum, every 6 months. So it turned out to be a very fortuitous thing, and it was something I developed purely for me to be able to take pictures that I knew other photographers couldn't, and it was about giving my portfolio an edge. And in the end, we turned it the way, and it was quite an interesting lesson for professional photography, in that the traditional view of professional photography is you take a great photo and then you sell that photo through whichever means to make an income. And what the Magic Filters experience taught me was that, yes, I took a great photo that people wanted to emulate, but rather than cash in on the photo, I cashed in on the technique, the education, the equipment side of it. And that was a sort of, quite a big sort of light bulb moment in terms of how to forge the financial side of the career, in that, as a photographer, you still make money from your photos, but it's not always just, give it to the stock agent, give it to the magazine and get your money. There are other ways that a great photo can earn you money, and that has been really valuable for a professional career.
And I just wanted to touch on the flashes that you use. Is there a particular brand that you swear by, or?
So these days I use, my flash guns are from two brands. One is Seacam and one is Retra. And Retra is a company that is relatively new on the scene, but they're really pushing the technology forward in underwater flash guns. They've introduced high-speed flash sync, so they've found flash tubes that can do high-speed flash sync. They've put a lot of effort into creating really, really good quality of light and produce easy-to-use accessories that allow us to change that quality of light underwater. So you can take a couple of accessories down with you, clip them on, turn them on. So we've got everything from beam restrictors, which can help you not light up the particles in dirty water, to different coloured diffusion filters, so that you can warm or cool the light to the level you want to, only subtly, but it makes a big difference to the look of the pictures. They've even got like optical snoots, so rather than just restricting it with a mechanical snoot, they've actually got lenses in them, so you can get a really strong pinpoint of light, allowing you to photograph, even in bright, sunny, tropical conditions, photograph a small subject, in a spotlight if you want to. Which is also valuable. So, that's a really interesting area in underwater photography. And I think that, for me, has been the big change in the last 10 years, is the gear worked 10 years ago, but over this last 10 years, the housings, the optics and the lighting has all been refined to give us a capability that we didn't have before. And that's really exciting. And it also means it's why the photos we take today continue to be so much more polished, so much more exciting, so much more interesting than what we were able to do a decade ago.
Yeah, it's a whole new world for me. It's really interesting to hear that. Let me ask you, is there anything in your bag that you just never use?
It depends if my wife is going to listen to this or not. Actually, she loves photography as a hobby. And so she's always and she particularly likes photographing orchids and wild orchids and mushrooms when we're out and about in the countryside. So anything that's a macro lens is fine by her. I can buy as many of those as I want. There's always a few things that aren't getting as much use. There's kind of some much loved old lenses that have now been superseded, and we've been through such good times together that I can't face getting rid of them too much. I try and operate a one in, one out policy. And it's also why I know MPB, because it's a place where I've sent stuff, and that way it keeps things reasonable. But every now and again I'll be in a hurry and I'm just like, I'd like to try that, and I can't be bothered to find something to send in as a one in, one out. Which I think that's just really from a practical point of view of not ending up with a house full of so much gear to try. But but no, most things get used, and I everything from old vintage lenses right the way through to the latest underwater designed optics. And we use some quite unusual things underwater. For example, one of my main fisheye lenses is, back in the 90s, Nikon made a film SLR called the Nikonos RS that could go underwater. And for that lens, they designed a fisheye lens that was designed specifically to work in water. Water has a different fractive index to air. So if you put a glass window in front of any land lens, it will work underwater. But that interface creates optical issues. You can design a lens to work in water, but it won't work in air. And Nikon did this with their fisheye lens for their Nikonos RS camera. Mm-hmm. That lens doesn't work on a modern SLR, but you can reprogram it so it will. And actually, I use one of those for a lot of my wide angle because it's got fantastic optical performance, even though it's quite an old lens. So it's a really, really, really good quality optic, and it's designed to be used underwater. So that's so there's some quite strange things out there that we use.
Well, ironically, the thing that I've got in my bag that I'm never using is a fisheye lens. Haven't used it for years, and I think most of us have something that we're not using. So why not trade it in to MPB for something you will use? MPB buys, sells and trades thousands of items each week, and everything comes with a 6-month warranty. So I'll put a link in the show notes where you can get a quote for selling your unused kit to MPB, and I'll make a link to all of the gear Alex mentioned. So thanks to the good people at MPB for sponsoring the gear round. Let's go on to double exposure. So this is where I'm going to ask you about a particular shot, and then maybe there's a particular shot or moment from your career or for your photography journey that's really memorable that you could share about as well. So I picked out a few shots that I was going to ask you about, but I think I've settled on one. It's called Anemone Fish Over Tentacles, Indonesia. So you've got this top-down view, I think, of a fish and all these tentacles, and this, what you used the word earlier yourself, gesture, something I'm always looking for in my photography, gesture. The picture has a beautiful movement to it. Do you know the one I'm talking about? And,
yes.
Can you tell me if there's a story behind that one?
I took that in a place called Lembeh Strait, which is in Sulawesi in central Indonesia, a very remote area. And it's a place that underwater photographers go to because this narrow strait of water is protected from the open ocean but has strong, strong currents. So it's full of rich life. It's quite murky water, so it doesn't have nice coral reefs. The seabed is often black sand, but there are amazing animals live there. The topography looks quite like diving in a sea loch, actually. But living there are seahorses and amazing octopus and hairy frogfish and all sorts of weird animals live there. And everyone goes there to see these amazing weird animals. And anemone fish are one of the more common coral reef inhabitants, and no one goes to this place to photograph an anemone fish. But on this particular dive, I just saw this anemone fish, and I just saw this incredible image. And it was a case of, you go in the water with a plan, and my plan was not to photograph an anemone fish. It was to see all these weird animals. But right. I just saw this opportunity and was drawn to it. And I always tell my workshop groups when we go there that my most successful picture from this place that we've come to see all these rare animals is an anemone fish that, you've all seen a million times. But, so don't, be aware as an underwater photographer, keep your mind open for the photographic opportunities. So that's what drew me to this picture. It is also one of the pictures I was referring to before, in that it was taken with a 6 megapixel Nikon D100 a long time ago. And the picture is still regularly used. It's still printed, full page in magazines, on covers and things like that. And it's a reminder that, although we get all obsessed about latest and greatest camera equipment, strong images, even taken on not the best gear, still appeal. It's always all about the image. So although I was saying earlier I shoot a D850 currently because I want that future proofing, this picture, despite being quite old, is not aged at all in terms of its appeal to the market.
Yeah, it's totally fantastic, and the color, I'm colorblind, but to me the colors look really vibrant. I don't know if I'm not seeing it. Maybe it's even
they're definitely vibrant, yeah.
It's so amazing, and the movement in the fish, I was thinking, if that fish was straight, presumably you fired off a few just like this, but if that fish is straight, I don't think it works. The picture works as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, that sinuous movement is so typical of the underwater world, and actually really difficult to capture. It's something I'm always, going on to people about is, how visually appealing those curves are in pictures, and actually how hard they are to find. And it's particularly because, a lot of fish, it's actually need that bottom up or top down view to see that movement as they swim. And usually as photographers, we try and get down to eye level and get eye contact with them. And it's a reminder of how lucky we are as underwater photographers that we have this ability to shoot subjects from this diversity of angles, because we're free to move in 3 dimensions just like a drone. And I think this is a great example of that freedom, allowing you to express yourself. And I think it was also a picture that was possible because anemone fish are one of the few subjects, along with sharks, that everyone, and maybe seahorses, that everyone in the street knows. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I have a little bit more flexibility as a photographer to not just have to shoot them the straight obvious way. And I feel that I can be more interpretive in my photography with them, and my audience will still get the shot. Whereas, if I went that wacky with some fish that no one, the lesser spotted damselfish, people will be like, oh, I don't understand what's going on there. Whereas I think with the anemone fish, people know that story. So photographically, I have a bit more freedom to tell it in a more interesting way.
It's a cracker. So is there, I don't know if there's a moment or a particular shot that just stands out for you? Anything you can tell us about?
I think pictures, as I said, I'm a, sort of more stock editorial photographer. So I'm generally shooting a lot of work, and it's always about what's next rather than what's gone on in the past. I think the photos that have been sort of career defining or door opening are really, the ones that tend to have a resonance. Even if they're pictures that maybe you don't show that much anymore, or you don't feel they represent your work now, they are those landmarks in the career. And I would say that the first photo that I had awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, which won the animal or the portraits category back in 2005, so a long time ago now. That picture as a door opener, it's actually in the you were teasing me earlier about the photos with royalty, but it's the photo that's in the background of the picture of me and the Queen. And I think that is, that was an incredible image in that for a long time it existed just as my shot on my hard drive that, I liked and a few of my friends thought was great. And I, threw it in. I entered it into the Wildlife Photographer competition. I'd entered the competition plenty of times before, right from when I was a student at university. And I'd always, hoped to do well, but never really expected it. And then suddenly I was a winner in this competition. And then, competitions like that are such a springboard for you, within, the day the competition announced, the picture was, in all the newspapers. And, the first time that happens to you as a photographer where a picture goes really, really mainstream. We'd call it viral these days, or perhaps we wouldn't use that word anymore. But they go everywhere. And the first time that happens to you, it's kind of everyone who's known you through your life sees it, and you just get this barrage of contact and communication. And then also because publishers, magazines, everyone is always looking for the new talent. Yeah. And it was ridiculous period. I would get literally 30, 40 emails a day for about 3 weeks after that of just, would you join this agency? I think the world has changed a bit as well since then, in that, social media hadn't really taken off at that time. It was, and so it was harder maybe for newer photographers to be discovered in other ways. But I just got, just this trackload of, would you join our agency? We'd really love to feature you in this magazine. Would you do this? Would you do that? And it was incredibly valuable. So, and, even led up to me, presenting the collection to the Queen and things like that. And it was, really, really real life-changing photo. And just the difference, it's the same picture on my hard drive now, but it was, maybe if I hadn't entered it, it would never have been seen. And the nature of competitions are so fickle that you could enter the same picture the next year and one judge wouldn't go for it, and it would be an also ran. Yeah. And so just all that sort of fortune coming together, I think is something that, definitely one of those kind of sliding doors moments of it could easily have not happened, but it changed so many things in my life. So that picture's always really special. Yeah.
Is it I don't have the picture of the Queen up in front of me. Is it the angry gang of fish?
Yeah, picture? It's the angry fish. And they're not angry at all. And it's one of the keys to fish photography is, you're dealing with a subject that people maybe don't have strong emotional connections with. Yeah. And so as a photographer, you're trying all the tricks you can to generate that emotional connection with the subject matter. And with a fish, when you capture an angle that allows people to project some emotion, to project some personality onto your subject, your fish becomes more than just being a scaly, slimy fish. It becomes a character, an individual that people can connect with. And it's I'm always very proud to do well in those sort of mainstream photographic competitions without having to go down the A-list subject route. It's great when you win with sharks, and I've won the wildlife photographer with whale sharks and, all sorts of big things as well. But I love the fact that, a normal fish can win if you can get it right.
Yeah, it's just like the fish in the foreground looks amazing, but then when you see that first, obviously, and then later you see the ones in the background, and it just adds so much. It sort of adds a lot of humour to it. I think you think, well, these guys don't look too happy.
And that was a point I made earlier was that, I think that you strive as a photographer to keep pushing those boundaries. And that was a picture that used a new technique that I was working on at the time, which I latterly, more recently called underwater telephoto, of using a very unusual flash setup and everything with the flash guns way in front of the camera to cut down the light path to the subject to allow me to shoot with a longer lens underwater. And no one had ever tried that technique before. And there's no doubt that the judges of the competition had no idea how that picture was taken, but they reacted to the novelty of it. And if I look through, particularly like just in the wildlife photographer, if I look through a number of the pictures that I've had awarded in that competition, they've all had some sort of innovation in them, of me trying to push a boundary back. And there's definitely a lesson in that. And in every single case, the judge would not have been aware of that innovation at all. But they've reacted to the freshness of the image. And it's why I think it's so important to be pushing those boundaries back, because people, even if they can't put their finger on it, they react to the fact that something is fresh and new and different. And so it's something that, I think is really critical to be constantly trying to innovate in your photography, because it's when you break that new ground is actually when people, I've got too many examples, a too high a proportion of my, most kind of viral, kind of, celebrated, well-known shots have been when I've tried to do something a little bit fresh, not reinvent the wheel, but just that little tweak to just try and do something people haven't done before. And when you get something right in that way, you create not only an eye-catching image, but an eye-catching image that's got that intangible feeling of freshness, which I think really appeals in those markets and opens the doors.
I think it's amazing advice, actually. I'll put links to all those images in the show notes. Okay, so over time now, and let's do the quick fire round. Let's do it quick, okay? This is Motor Drive. One, wide angle or telephoto?
A wide angle.
Okay, coffee or tea?
Neither for me, thanks. I don't like hot drinks.
Okay, head or heart?
Heart, because as an underwater photographer, I think head rules too much of the time because of the technical constraints.
Okay, this is the big one. Finding Nemo or Titanic?
Oh, I'm a marine life guy. I do enjoy my wrecks, but yeah, it's got to be the marine life.
Isn't it? Okay. Okay, I don't know how this applies to what you do, but expensive lens cloth or the corner of your shirt?
I'd like to be expensive lens cloth, but it's nearly always my t-shirt.
Okay, so okay, we don't have time to get into how you do that under the water, but let's move on. Okay, who's a photographer we should all follow?
I'd say my favourite photographer, who most people will know, is Jim Brandenburg. I think his vision and his use of light and his ability to create those, groundbreaking images that remain iconic after so many years in the wildlife photography world. He's someone everyone should follow. Okay,
I'll put that in the show notes. It looks like you go all over the world with your workshops, and I'm really envious. It looks like a fantastic life you've got, when there's not a pandemic on. But is there a dream location that you'd still love to shoot?
Oh, hundreds and hundreds. But I try to make my dream location the one I'm going to next. There's no point, be dreaming of swimming with blue whales in the Indian Ocean when I'm perhaps, up shooting in the sea locks up in Scotland or something. I try to make the place I'm going to my dream location at that time. So I don't like to ask myself that question. I much rather be as enthusiastic and as passionate about what I'm shooting, because I think that comes through in the images. If you're dreaming of great white sharks when you're supposed to be photographing sea slugs, you're not going to take great sea slug pictures. You've got to be at that moment the biggest fan of sea slugs there is. And I think you'll pour that love into your pictures, go that extra mile and create something special.
That's a great answer. Okay, when do you feel at peace with the universe?
Oh, definitely underwater. There's many people around the world who are addicted to diving just for the sensation. The fact that I get to do it and do a creative endeavour while doing that, and being weightless and being free and being surrounded by accepting, underwater light and incredible beauty and fascination, which is so varied around the world in terms of underwater. The underwater world is not the same everywhere. I mean, that is definitely the Zen spot, especially on the rare occasion that my wife's able to come with me too.
Alex, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Hope you can get back out into the water this year. Looks like things are going in the right direction.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. Follow Alex on Instagram. Check out his website to find out more about his photography and his workshops. Links to everything we spoke about are in the show notes. And if you liked this episode, then check out my conversations with Howard Schatz from Season 2 and Julian Terreros Martin from Season 1. Thanks for your time. Enjoy your photography, and I'll see you out there.